First story. Months have passed since that day in 2022, and he has not reappeared. A relief, I pray, is permanent. The trauma lingers for all of us. But for me, the incident is laced with a profound feeling of foolishness. As the older sister, I feel stupid for not recognizing the glaring warning signs, the unreturned calls, the reliance only on text messages that signaled something was deeply wrong. My resolution is simple. I will be endlessly more cautious, and I will never again venture into secluded places, especially when I am responsible for another person's safety. To describe that day, hectic doesn't even begin to cover it. Work during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic was a relentless circus, and I was stuck working remotely. I was due at my parents' house upstate for a family gathering, but I ended up trapped on a nearly 3-hour Zoom meeting, finally escaping an hour and a half after everyone else had already arrived. That didn't even account for the 2 hours of driving I still faced. Before leaving, I fortified myself with 2 mugs of coffee in the kitchen. Given the circumstances, I knew I'd need every drop. The instant I pulled open the front door, I realized the drive itself would be a far greater challenge than the meeting had been. The snow and wind had intensified dramatically since the early evening, and the residential streets were barely touched by plows. There was already a 2-foot accumulation on the ground, and the forecast promised the heavy snowfall would continue most of the night. I was forced to crawl along the local roads, often keeping my speed below 25 miles per hour. My car at the time was an unreliable, aging Toyota, absolutely the worst vehicle for severe weather. Adding to the danger, it lacked anti-lock brakes. Despite the terrible conditions, I have a heavy foot. Once I hit the highway, I pushed the speed up to 70, which was undeniably reckless for the blizzard-like conditions. I finally reached my parents' house around 9 p.m. Dinner was underway, but fortunately, they hadn't progressed too far without me. A blur of drinks and exchanging gifts followed, and I quickly lost track of the clock. I became so engrossed in catching up with relatives I hadn't seen in ages that I effectively forgot I still had to make the long drive back, even as other family members began to depart. By the time I finally settled into my car to leave, it was well past midnight, and another foot of snow had piled up. I was definitely buzzed, but in my exhausted state, I made the poor judgment that I was sober enough to drive home. I would never endorse drinking and driving, but I was simply tired and desperate for my own bed. As I started heading toward the highway entrance, the roads were eerily deserted. In a lapse of judgment, I cranked the speed up to 40 on one stretch. It was a grave mistake. As I approached a sharp bend, my old Hyundai instantly went into a skid. Though this wasn't my first slide, panic began to rise. I instinctively tried the right maneuvers, steering into the skid and downshifting. But as the curve loomed, the car refused to slow its momentum. I braced myself as the car shot straight off the pavement, slamming violently into a tree. The airbag deployed with a blinding force. I was momentarily stunned by the impact, but thankfully I was mostly unharmed. My car, however, was demolished. The entire hood was lodged deep within a snowbank surrounding the tree. Pushing it back onto the road was impossible. My first coherent action was calling roadside assistance. They promised a tow truck, but warned that due to the atrocious weather, the wait could be as long as 40 minutes. I was completely alone on a desolate road, flanked by dense forest with no houses visible in either direction. I decided to call my parents next, asking if one of them could drive over and wait with me. My dad agreed to come immediately. I hung up the phone and waited, the only sounds the relentless wind and the quiet tick of the cooling engine. Then, over the howling of the blizzard, I picked up a different sound. Undeniably, footsteps crunching in the deep snow. I couldn't pinpoint the exact source, but they sounded somewhat distant. I unlatched the driver's door and stepped out, peering cautiously over the roof of my wrecked car. The footsteps had stopped. Now, I heard something else, a difficult sound of place like a wet, sickening slurping. I fixed my gaze toward the tree line where the noise originated and caught a glimpse of movement. It was pitch black, yet I was certain I was looking at a human shape. I called out, "Hello." The slurping sound ceased instantly. No one answered. I stood there for a few awkward seconds, heart pounding, but the figure neither responded nor revealed itself further. Second story. To set the scene clearly, I am hard of hearing, a persistent disability that colors how I experience the world. While I've learned to live with the gaps, the things I'll simply never quite grasp. This event, which took place about a year ago, is one I can't stop revisiting. I perpetually wonder if different actions or sharper senses would have changed the outcome. The timing was crucial. The celebratory chaos of the holidays had just concluded, leaving me exhausted and ready to settle back in my routine. My home sits in a small, sleepy suburban neighborhood in southern Quebec, positioned right on the cusp of a dense forest. My neighborhood is the essence of sleepy suburbia, where familiarity breeds comfort. Most residents know each other by name, fostering a warmth and sense of community that I truly value. As winter blankets the ground, my favorite routine is taking my dog, Monty, for long walks into the adjacent woods. He's a robust Rottweiler Husky mix, a powerhouse perfectly suited for the occasional run I enjoy taking. The forest itself is user-friendly, crisscrossed by several well-maintained trails that welcome even the most casual walker. I recall it was a still afternoon in February, colder than usual for the month. I just finished a late lunch and decided the best way to spend the energy was to burn off those calories with Monty. As always, the moment we rounded the corner toward the forest entrance, my dog went absolutely ballistic. The sight of the trail, even in the bracing cold, instantly flipped his switch from calm companion to eager, pulling sled dog. A crisp, new covering of white had settled while we slept, rendering the familiar paths into a stunning, uniform expanse. Naturally, I immediately unleashed Monty so he could revel in his freedom, bounding through the pristine powder. The canvas wasn't entirely spotless, though. I could spot a few telltale yellow patches and several boot prints, signaling that a few early risers and their dogs had already been through. Since the sun dips around 4 p.m. in the winter, most regulars get their walks in before noon, so I fully expected to have the forest to ourselves. After about 30 minutes of easy walking, we reached a fork in the path. One direction was clearly trodden, but the other, smaller trail was completely untouched. Feeling a spark of mild adventure and confident in my photographic memory of these woods, I decided we'd take the virgin snow. I knew precisely where the trail led, guaranteeing we wouldn't lose our way. The fresh path opened directly into a small clearing, a perfect spot for the bird watching I'd been meaning to do with my new Christmas binoculars. I raised the lenses and began to sweep the distant tree line. My attention snagged on a peculiar shape nestled against the dense woods. When I focused the glass, I realized it was a blue tarp stretched over what looked distinctly like a rudimentary, makeshift shelter. Curiosity wrestled with the clock. The light was fading rapidly, and I decided getting home was the priority. I called Monty, turned around, and we started our retreat. Immediately, I sensed a change in my dog. He shot ahead, as usual, but his whole demeanor was different. He was highly alert, ears pitched forward, his nose working the ground with an intensity one hadn't seen before. Then I looked down at the snow and my eyes snapped wide. Imprinted in the otherwise smooth white surface was a set of footprints drastically larger than my own. A jolt of confusion hit me so strongly that I actually lifted my boot to turn it over, holding it next to the indentation in a stunned, instinctive comparison. The sheer size difference of the prints left me utterly perplexed. There was no other junction on this secluded path, meaning the person who made them must have passed me at some point. I reasoned that they had slipped by while I was absorbed in using my binoculars. It was the only explanation that made any sense at the time, and I tried hard to settle on that logic. Why now? The forest was significantly dimmer, though I could still make out the shapes around us. Suddenly, Monty slammed on the brakes and began barking furiously. Not into the woods, but directly behind me did I spun around. There he was, a man, easily 6'4", dressed in dark charcoal snow pants and a white camouflage jacket, standing barely a meter away. He was completely still, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, making absolutely no move toward me. He was a complete stranger, certainly not one of the familiar faces from the neighborhood, leading me to assume he was a hiker or visitor from out of town. It looked as if he was muttering something in my direction. Due to the failing light, compounded by my hearing loss and the uncertainty of whether he was speaking English or French, the local languages in Quebec, I couldn't make out a single word. I instantly regretted leaving my phone at home. Feeling foolishly vulnerable, I resorted to gesturing, attempting to communicate that I was hard of hearing and that I needed to leave because of the late hour that we reached home around 4:30 p.m. By then, the night had fully descended. I followed my usual nighttime routine, consciously pushing the strange, silent encounter from my mind. That night, my standard routine was violently interrupted by something that still sends shivers down my spine. I woke abruptly to Monty's insistent licking, his typical morning tactic to drag me out of bed. Groggily, I checked my phone. The screen glared 3 a.m. My confusion deepened when I saw a recent text from my neighbor asking if everything was okay. It was only a few minutes old and mentioned that Monty had been barking as if possessed. I looked up. My dog was gone. I raced downstairs to find him in a state of hysterical, unrelenting barking directed squarely at the glass patio door. My vision was still swimming in sleep blurriness as I approached. Just as I struggled to focus my eyes, the motion sensor light in the backyard flared on. My heart bottomed out. Standing there, in the middle of my backyard, was the man from the forest. Every thought instantly vanished. I didn't pause to question how or why. I simply backed away from the door and immediately texted 911. I doubt I have ever typed a crisis message with such blinding speed. Grabbing Monty, I bolted back upstairs and pulled the machete from its hiding place beneath my bed. Though I am a shorter woman with martial arts training, I subscribe to the belief that the smartest move is often to avoid the fight entirely. I barricaded myself in the room, focusing solely on protecting myself and my dog until help arrived. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I sat rigid, Monty pressed against my side, facing the door. The tension snapped when Monty suddenly leaped up, barking a raw, desperate warning at the bedroom door. My palms drenched with sweat as I watched a dark shadow creep and lengthen from beneath the gap of the door. The lingering shadow beneath the door, magnified by the nightlight, was a clear signal. The man was imminently about to force his way in. Those minutes felt impossibly protracted as I braced for the sound of the door handle twisting or the wood splintering. Mercifully, the break-in never came. When the police finally arrived, I recounted the entire harrowing sequence. As they swept the property, the only damage they found was the patio door glass, which was completely smashed. Everything else, strangely, was undisturbed and accounted for. The officers noted that my backyard gate, which leads directly into the forest, was open, suggesting the intruder had simply retreated back into the woods. I immediately mentioned the makeshift shelter I had spotted earlier. Taking Monty and a few essentials, I went to stay with a family friend for a few days while the patio door was replaced. I never received any formal follow-up from the authorities. Since that terrifying night, I've strictly confined my dog walks to the paved roads, determined not to dwell on the chilling memory. Third story. My name is Charlie, and I'm a 16-year-old living in Illinois with my 15-year-old younger sister, Alice. My dad works for a deforestation company roughly 30 minutes away from home. It was a typical morning on December 5th. Alice and I were getting ready for a day out at the cinema. Our plan was to see the newer horror flick, Terrifier 3, which had some unexpected Christmas elements. We knew it was strictly 18 plus, but we assumed that our older than our age appearance would get us past the ticket counter easily. Halfway through the film, just as the audience was leaning forward in collective anticipation, my phone vibrated with a loud, attention-grabbing buzz. The sudden noise killed the vibe instantly, drawing annoyed stares from everyone around me. Mortified, Alice and I made a hasty exit, a process made even more embarrassing when I stumbled clumsily in the aisle. Once outside, I checked the source of the interruption. It was my dad, before I could call him back. However, a text message came through. It read something casual like, "Hey, would you mind dropping off some lunch? That small cafe in the woods is closed today." I glanced at Alice, who looked slightly confused, but neither of us questioned the request. It seemed like a perfectly normal ask. We drove home, packed up his meal, and headed out toward the wooded area downtown where he worked. The lake and the stranger. I've always cherished that area. It was vast, secluded, and possessed a quiet grandeur that always made me feel completely at ease. The scenery was stunning, especially the way the hill sloped down to the lake. A perfect spot for fishing and photography. We parked the car, and Alice and I began walking down the winding woodland path. I pulled out my phone to call Dad, but the call went straight to voicemail. That pause was our first flicker of unease. Why would he text us to come all this way only to ignore our call? I quickly sent him a text, letting him know we had arrived with his lunch. Almost immediately, the little typing dots appeared. He messaged back, instructing us to take the small trail down the hill and wait for him by the lake. We followed the direction. The sun was already dipping, a consequence of the early winter sunset, casting a beautiful, radiant orange glow over the ridge and the lake below. Snapping me out of my contemplation, Alice suddenly pointed down. Seated on a lakeside deck, facing away from us, was a man dressed entirely in black. We immediately assumed it was Dad. We approached quietly, stopping a few feet behind him. I called out his name, but the figure didn't stir. Alice grew visibly anxious, and her mounting fear injected a creeping sense of dread into the whole scene. Hesitantly, I reached out and pulled back the hood he was wearing. It was not our father. Alice and I shrieked simultaneously as the man turned to face us. He had a maniacal smile plastered across his face, and he was waving our dad's phone in the air like a taunting trophy. "Why are you using my dad's phone?" I blurted out, demanding an answer that wasn't forthcoming. Instead of speaking, he suddenly lunged and snatched Alice's arm, eliciting a sharp scream from her. Thankfully, I had the strength to rip her free, and without a second thought, we turned and ran as fast as our legs could carry us. Escape and the ominous message. A surge of pure adrenaline rocketed through us. I don't think either Alice or I have ever run with such desperate speed. The heavy thudding footsteps gaining behind me confirmed we were being pursued, but I refused to spare a glance backward. We finally burst out of the woods and reached the car. I threw us inside, slamming the doors shut and locking them just as the man reached my window. I instinctively ducked below the sight line, jammed the car into reverse, and peeled away, tearing back toward the main road. When we arrived home, gasping for air, both my mother and father were thankfully there. We tumbled inside, frantically relaying the terrifying incident. Dad was incensed. He explained that his phone had been stolen while he was on the job, forcing him to quit work early and return home. He realized the man must have taken the device and sent us that deceptive text message. Dad immediately contacted the police and filed a report. They used the phone's IMEI number to track the device. It was recovered still sitting on the deck by the lake and subsequently returned to him. The police concluded that since the property was found, their hands were tied. There was little more they could actively do. We thought that was the end of our nightmare. If it were, I wouldn't be recounting this story. 6 hours later, around 1 a.m., my phone vibrated with an unknown number. The message was short, simple, and utterly chilling. "I like that your house is lit only by your bedroom TV." The message drained the color from my face. I went instantly cold and pale. I hit the pause button on my TV, plunging the room into silence. A silence immediately broken by a faint rustling sound coming from outside my second-floor window. Clutching my phone, I crept to the blinds and slowly, cautiously peeked out. What I saw made me scream. The man was there, looking up, smiling directly at me, with a gun aimed at my window. I recoiled violently just as the glass exploded inward, showering my room in shards. My parents and Alice rushed in. Shaking, I yelled at them to get down, shouting that the man had a weapon. When Dad cautiously checked the window, the figure was gone. However, the silence was instantly replaced by another deafening crash of breaking glass coming from the kitchen downstairs. We scrambled, locking the bedroom door as Alice frantically dialed 911. My mother held us tight as we both dissolved into terrified tears. Through the chaos, One question echoed relentlessly in my mind. How did he know where we lived? It didn't take long for the police to arrive. They searched the house thoroughly. The intruder was nowhere to be found. As Alice and I recounted the events, one of the officers suggested checking the car. To our shock, they discovered a small air tag discreetly placed on one of my tires. This was the chilling explanation. It showed how he had tracked us home and why he had ducked down out of sight before I drove away from the woods. The police promised increased patrols and vowed to do everything possible to locate the man.